Back then, we had no radar guiding our eyes, no night vision to pierce the dark. Only the roar of engines, the smell of aviation fuel, and the prayers of boys barely out of adolescence. I remember my first flight over Normandy, the dawn breaking through smoke and fog, a golden glow reflecting off the metal wings of the P-47 Thunderbolts. The Germans had fortified their skies. Anti-aircraft guns bristled like metal porcupines, and fighters prowled like wolves, shadows on the horizon, waiting. Yet the Americans brought something different: precision, speed, and an unrelenting will. They called it the Thunderbolt, but to the boys from the Luftwaffe it was the hammer of the gods. I remember the first time we saw the Thunderbolts descend upon a German convoy near Caen. Trucks overturned, fuel tanks erupted into fireballs, soldiers scattered like ants under a magnifying glass. The sheer noise, the roaring engines, the thunder of falling bombs, the metallic whine of machine guns was deafening. They didn't just attack the soldiers, they attacked their morale, their very belief that the sky was theirs to control. The pilots had trained relentlessly for this moment. Day after day, the P-47s roared across airfields in England, engine exhaust painting the dawn orange, wings heavy with bombs and courage. They learned to dive with precision, to climb with power, to hit and vanish before the Germans could respond. Every sortie brought lessons. Every engagement refined their instincts. I remember one mission over Saint-Lô. The hedgerows hid German infantry, tanks, and artillery. Every turn, every twist in the earth could conceal a deadly trap. But the Thunderbolts didn't hesitate. Bombs fell with meticulous accuracy. Strafing runs carved through armored positions, and the roar of engines drowned the screams below. I remember one mission over Saint-Lô. The hedgerows hid German infantry, tanks, and artillery. Every turn, every twist in the earth could conceal a deadly trap. But the Thunderbolts didn't hesitate. Bombs fell with meticulous accuracy. Strafing runs carved through armored positions, and the roar of engines drowned the screams below. And it wasn't just the firepower that struck fear into the German ranks. It was the coordination. The P-47s worked in tandem with P-51 escorts, medium bombers, reconnaissance planes, an invisible network stretching across the battlefield, each aircraft aware of the other, each movement deliberate, each strike devastating. The pilots themselves were ordinary men doing extraordinary things. I remember Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Caldwell, barely 21, speaking of his first kill with a mix of fear and awe. I saw the plane go down, and for a second I thought, it can't be real. Each young pilot carried with him the weight of nations, and each mission was a gamble with life and death, hanging by the thinnest thread of a propeller blade. Yet, in the midst of the chaos, there were moments of strange beauty. Sunlight glinting off aluminum wings, contrails weaving intricate patterns across a blue sky, a hum of a well-tuned engine, a sense of order within the storm. And below, the Germans could only stare in disbelief,
watching as their fortifications, their tanks, their meticulously planned defenses were reduced to rubble by an unstoppable force from the sky. In those days, we realized something fundamental. Air superiority wasn't just a military advantage. It was psychological. Every flight, every sortie, every dive sent a message to the enemy. The skies belonged to us, and resistance was futile. The Thunderbolts didn't just win battles. They shattered illusions, broke morale, and redefined what it meant to dominate a battlefield.
The morning mist still clung to the French countryside when the thunderbolts roared overhead. I remember gripping the sides of the observation post, feeling the vibrations in my chest as if the very earth were trembling. German soldiers froze in their foxholes, their eyes tracing the silver streaks across the sky. Some whispered prayers, others cursed under their breath, but all of them knew the storm had arrived. We had never seen anything move like it. Machines that could dive like falcons, engines that sang with a ferocity no human voice could match. The P-47s weren't just planes, they were extensions of human will, metal and fire fused to courage and precision. Each Thunderbolt carried bombs and guns, yes, but also a certainty, a promise of destruction that the German infantry couldn't hope to escape. I remember watching a squadron lead a coordinated strike on a German supply train snaking through the Normandy hills. The lead Thunderbolt pilot dove first, releasing his payload with surgical accuracy. Explosions ripped the air apart. Trucks were tossed into hedgerows, ammunition crates erupted like fireworks, and the soldiers, so confident in their iron trains, scattered in panic. One lieutenant later wrote in his report, "It was like watching the sky itself come alive to hunt us." The Germans tried to retaliate with flak, anti-aircraft fire that had torn through countless Allied planes before, but not these. The Thunderbolts, heavy yet fast, seemed to slip through the clouds of shrapnel as if guided by instinct. Pilots learned to use the terrain to their advantage, weaving through valleys, skimming treetops, and then climbing swiftly to dive again. Each attack was a rhythm, a deadly dance choreographed by training, bravery, and the machinery itself. And there was terror in the skies, too. Luftwaffe fighters scrambled to intercept, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulf streaking toward the P-47s with guns blazing. But the Thunderbolts were built like tanks with wings. They could absorb hits, dive hard, and retaliate with strafing runs that shredded the enemy. I remember one particular engagement over Caen. 5 Thunderbolts faced a dozen German fighters. By the time the smoke cleared, 3 enemy aircraft were down, and the remaining pilots fled, shaken, muttering disbelief to each other. On the ground, the effect was just as dramatic. German soldiers abandoned strongpoints, surrendering to units they had once thought unassailable. Every village and road was under observation, every convoy vulnerable. The Thunderbolts weren't just aircraft. They were a statement, a rolling threat that America could supply, strike, and sustain a war on a scale the Germans couldn't comprehend.
The logistics behind this dominance were astonishing. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, maintenance crews, all worked tirelessly to keep the Thunderbolts in the air. I remember the endless convoys of trucks arriving at airfields, mechanics wiping sweat from their foreheads as they replaced engines, patched wings, and ensured that each plane could rise again, day after day, mission after mission. It was a marvel of organization, efficiency, and sheer human determination. And the pilots. The pilots were relentless. They spoke little of fear, but in quiet moments, in letters home, you could read it. The adrenaline, the constant threat of death, the knowledge that one miscalculation could send you spiraling into the earth, these haunted them. Yet every sortie they climbed back into the cockpit, engines roaring, bombs loaded, courage renewed. They weren't just fighting the Germans, they were fighting fatigue, fear, and the limits of human endurance itself. By mid-1944, the Thunderbolts had transformed the battlefield. German defensive lines that once seemed impregnable crumbled under relentless air assault. Artillery positions were silenced before they could fire. Armored columns destroyed in minutes. Communication lines severed by precision bombing. Entire regiments found themselves cut off, bewildered, unable to understand how the Americans moved so quickly, struck so hard, and vanished just as suddenly. Soldiers would later write, "The sky belonged to them. We were trapped beneath it, waiting for the thunder to fall." And it did fall. For every village, every hill, every road, the Thunderbolts left a trail of destruction and disbelief. But it wasn't mere chaos. They struck with purpose, intelligence, and unerring accuracy. The Germans could plan all they wanted, but the sky had changed, and their calculations no longer mattered. Even the weather seemed to cooperate. Fog would lift just in time for a strike. Clouds would obscure the approach of bombers, only to clear as the Thunderbolt swept down. Every element of the battlefield, from ground to sky, was being rewritten by these aircraft and the men who flew them. And those who survived to write reports could only marvel and fear at the unstoppable force overhead. By late summer of 1944, the Thunderbolts had become a legend among both Allied forces and German troops. I can still remember reading the intercepted German communications, trembling slightly at the words they used. Himmelsmonsters, sie zerstören alles, sky monsters. They destroy everything. Every farm, every road, every convoy, nothing was safe from the relentless aerial storm. On the ground, the soldiers spoke in hushed tones, afraid that any sound might summon the next wave of P-47s. They knew the planes weren't just for bombing. They were intelligence, reconnaissance, artillery suppression, an omnipotent force that reshaped the battlefield. And yet, the Americans in the cockpits, they joked, laughed, even sang to the radio as engines roared beneath them, carrying death and liberation in equal measure. I recall a mission over a German supply depot near Falaise. 8 Thunderbolts approached in formation, each pilot peering through the canopy at the target below. Anti-aircraft fire erupted, black puffs of smoke blossoming around them. They moved as one, precision drilled through months of training. Bombs dropped, igniting fuel caches, ammunition trucks, and stockpiles in a chain reaction of fire that lit the landscape. Soldiers scrambling for cover were trapped by the sudden devastation. And yet there was an artistry to it. Pilots spoke of the rhythm of the battlefield, of timing each pass perfectly to avoid friendly fire, of using the sun to blind anti-aircraft gunners, of diving and pulling up just in time to minimize exposure. It wasn't just destruction, it was controlled, deliberate, almost poetic violence carried out in the name of liberation. Back at the airfields, mechanics worked tirelessly. Hours blurred into days as they replaced engines, patched wings, and refueled planes for the next sortie. One young mechanic, barely 19 years old, told me he slept under the wings at night just to ensure readiness for dawn. Every drop of fuel, every bolt, every round of ammunition mattered. The Germans could never comprehend the scale of this effort, the sheer efficiency that kept Thunderbolts in the sky day after day. The pilots themselves became legends among their comrades. Lieutenant John Red Hawk Harris once flew 12 missions in a single week, emerging unscathed, his Mustang nicked and scarred, but still deadly. In letters home, he admitted the fear, the exhaustion, but also the exhilaration of flying above the chaos, of seeing the enemy scattered below, powerless, unable to stop the storm. The Germans, meanwhile, grew desperate. They attempted ambushes, set traps, and concentrated their anti-aircraft guns along key roads. But the Americans adapted faster than they could plan. Thunderbolts employed a combination of altitude, speed, and coordinated strikes that made interception nearly impossible. Even elite Luftwaffe pilots struggled to match the P-47's rugged durability and firepower.
And the logistical feat behind it all, truly astonishing. The Red Ball Express, a network of supply trucks racing across France, ensured that fuel, ammunition, and spare parts arrived at forward airfields faster than the Germans could destroy them. Convoys moved day and night, drivers pushing beyond exhaustion, sometimes in near constant threat of ambush. Every successful delivery meant more Thunderbolts in the air, more strikes, more disruption of German plans. One night, I read a debrief from a squadron that had hit a heavily fortified town. German artillery batteries had been firing relentlessly, confident that no Allied aircraft could survive the barrage. But the Thunderbolts arrived at dawn, their wings glinting in the first light. Bombs fell with precision. Guns strafed the roads, and by mid-morning the batteries were silent. Soldiers surrendered, officers fled, and the town's defenses collapsed under the relentless skyward assault. Tales of individual heroism multiplied. A single pilot might destroy 10 trucks in one sortie. Another might take out a communications hub, severing phone lines and rendering entire divisions blind to incoming attacks. It wasn't luck. It was training, coordination, and an understanding of the battlefield that extended beyond ground tactics. The Thunderbolts didn't just strike, they orchestrated. By the end of the Normandy campaign, German troops whispered about the Thunderbolts with fear and awe. They had witnessed the impossible. Enemy air power that could strike anywhere, anytime, and disappear without warning. Entire supply lines were destroyed, reinforcements cut off, and morale shattered. The Americans had not merely attacked, they had rewritten the rules of engagement, proving that air superiority, combined with logistical genius, could overcome even the most entrenched defenses. And for the pilots and crews, it was far from over. Every village liberated, every road cleared, every convoy destroyed was another step toward the final victory, another testament to their relentless courage. They carried the burden of knowing that the lives below depended on them, that a mistake could cost thousands. And yet they pressed on, time and again, engines screaming, hearts steeled, eyes fixed on the horizon. The Thunderbolts didn't just fight, they inspired. Ground troops marched with renewed confidence, knowing that above them flew an unstoppable shield. Villagers whispered stories of the silver birds that came to free them. Even enemy soldiers, when captured, spoke of the American plains with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. As autumn of 1944 settled over France, the Thunderbolts' shadow stretched farther than any German commander could have imagined. They weren't just planes, they were moving fortresses of destruction, capable of turning a fortified position into ruins within minutes. German troops called them Himmelsherker, avengers of the sky, and for good reason. Each sortie was a carefully orchestrated symphony of fire, speed, and precision. I remember reading the journals of one forward observer who recounted the terror of seeing the P-47s arriving in waves, their engines growling like distant thunder. Artillery crews fired blindly, praying for luck, but the Thunderbolts seemed always one step ahead. Bombs fell where they were least expected, and machine gun strafing runs cut supply lines into ribbons of smoke and metal. The pilots spoke of the challenge not just as a test of skill, but of endurance. Missions often lasted 6, 8, sometimes 10 hours, with only brief moments to refuel or reload. Fatigue became a constant companion. Yet they persisted, driven by the knowledge that each destroyed convoy, each demolished bunker, meant fewer casualties for the advancing ground troops. They weren't just soldiers, they were guardians, watchful and relentless.
Behind the front lines, logistics worked miracles. The Red Ball Express continued to flow day and night, delivering fuel, spare parts, ammunition, and even food to airfields scattered across liberated France. Drivers faced not just enemy fire, but treacherous terrain, collapsing bridges, and the constant threat of mines. And yet somehow the supply chain never faltered. Thunderbolts took off fully fueled and armed, ready to unleash devastation on the enemy. One of the most striking moments occurred near Metz, where German forces had concentrated a massive supply depot. Intelligence reports indicated hundreds of trucks and dozens of artillery pieces waiting to support counterattacks. Thunderbolts descended at dawn, and the ensuing destruction was total. Engines roared as bombs tore through warehouses, fuel tanks ignited, and roads were rendered impassable. German soldiers fled in panic, unable to regroup. What made the Thunderbolts so effective was not just firepower, it was coordination. Pilots communicated constantly, relaying positions of enemy convoys, artillery nests, and armored columns. Ground controllers marked targets with smoke or signal flares, allowing airstrikes to hit with pinpoint accuracy. Each successful strike was carefully logged, and after-action briefings ensured lessons were learned for the next mission. The psychological impact on German soldiers was immense. Men who had once been confident in their positions now trembled at the mere whine of a P-47 engine. Soldiers described how entire companies would scatter at the first sight of the approaching planes. It wasn't simply fear, it was awe. The realization that no fortification, no road, no supply line was safe. The Thunderbolts had rewritten the rules of engagement.
One story, often repeated in whispered tones among Allied forces, involved a single pilot who destroyed an entire convoy with surgical precision. Each truck hit in succession, the column immobilized within minutes. Enemy troops attempting to salvage supplies were caught in strafing runs. The pilot returned to base exhausted, yet with a sense of grim satisfaction, knowing that his actions had saved countless lives on the ground. Meanwhile, German commanders struggled to respond. Anti-aircraft batteries were repositioned, camouflage nets deployed, and reinforcements rushed. But the Thunderbolts adapted faster than any countermeasure. Pilots learned to anticipate flak patterns, to dive and weave with deadly efficiency, and to exploit the rugged P-47's durability. Even planes struck by enemy fire often returned safely to base, engines smoking, wings scarred, but still lethal. On the home front, American mechanics and support staff worked around the clock. Spare parts were flown in from England, fuel and ammunition stockpiles constantly replenished, and repairs executed with astonishing speed. Pilots often marveled at the speed with which damaged aircraft were returned to service, sometimes within hours of a mission. It was a testament, not just to American industry, but to an entire culture of efficiency and determination. The Red Bull Express drivers, too, became heroes in their own right. Traveling over hundreds of miles of often damaged roads, they ensured the Thunderbolts remained armed and fueled. Night convoys moved under blackout conditions, avoiding enemy patrols and mines, delivering vital supplies that made the relentless air assaults possible. Without them, the P-47s would have been grounded. In one particularly daring mission over the Ardennes, Thunderbolts struck a series of German supply caches, cutting off reinforcements that could have halted the Allied advance. Soldiers on the ground later recounted the devastation, describing how roads were blocked, tanks immobilized, and artillery pieces destroyed in minutes. Each strike further eroded the enemy's morale and capacity to resist. And yet, for all the destruction, pilots often reflected on the human cost. Villages were liberated, and civilians who had endured months of occupation watched in awe and gratitude as the Thunderbolts roared overhead. Letters sent home spoke of the duality of war, the thrill of flying, and the sorrow for lives lost, both enemy and innocent. By late 1944, the Thunderbolts were no longer just aircraft, they were symbols. Symbols of freedom, of precision, of the unrelenting might of combined air and logistics. German forces began to whisper their fears, sharing stories of the planes that seemed unstoppable. Unstoppable not just in speed and firepower, but in their ability to coordinate, adapt, and dominate the skies above Europe. Every mission, every sortie, every daring strike reinforced the mythos of the Thunderbolts. They became legends not just to Allied troops, but to the enemy who had to face them day after day. And while the pilots would never admit it openly, many carried a quiet pride, knowing that their relentless efforts were not merely acts of war, but lifelines for countless soldiers and civilians below. As winter approached, the Thunderbolts prepared for their next great challenge, their engines humming in anticipation, their crews weary but determined, and their eyes fixed on a Europe slowly being freed from the grip of a collapsing regime. Winter 1944 had descended across Europe, casting long shadows over battle-scarred towns and forests scarred by months of relentless fighting. The German army, exhausted, ill-supplied and demoralized, faced an enemy that seemed unstoppable in both the air and on the ground. The Thunderbolts, those roaring, indestructible P-47s, continued their unrelenting campaign, striking fear into the hearts of enemy soldiers, while inspiring hope in the liberated. Reports from forward observers described entire German units dissolving in panic at the approach of the Thunderbolts. Roads that had once been arteries of supply became death traps, strafed relentlessly. Convoys obliterated, fuel caches burned, artillery destroyed. German soldiers whispered among themselves, "The Americans have fire from the heavens, and they will not relent." Behind the chaos, American pilots knew their work was far from glamorous. Long missions in freezing conditions, engines straining, guns firing, and bombs dropping, every sortie was a test of endurance and courage. Yet each successful mission meant fewer lives lost for Allied ground troops and hastened the liberation of occupied towns. Pilots wrote letters home in the quiet moments between missions, recounting not only the thrill of combat, but also the sorrow of seeing humans suffering, even among those they were sworn to fight. The Red Ball Express never stopped. Convoys sped along icy nights, bombed bridges and ambushes. They were the silent force behind the roar of engines and the flash of cannons. In early 1945, Thunderbolts played a crucial role in the final push across the Rhine. German defenses, already fractured by months of aerial bombardment and relentless artillery, began to collapse. Bridges that were key to moving reinforcements were destroyed. Roads clogged with wreckage prevented regrouping. P-47s dived and strafed, leaving devastation in their wake, while American ground forces advanced behind the cover of relentless air support. One pilot recalled a mission over the Ruhr Valley, where German armor was massing for a last-ditch defense. The Thunderbolts swooped in, strafing tanks and trucks with deadly precision. Engines roared, machine guns rattled, and bombs exploded, creating a scene of chaos so complete the German soldiers later admitted they believed the end had come from the skies, not the advancing infantry. The human cost was staggering, yet the coordination between air and ground forces, coupled with the precision of the Thunderbolts, minimized Allied casualties. Towns and civilians were often spared due to careful targeting, demonstrating not just military skill, but strategic and moral foresight. Pilots learned to differentiate between combatants and innocents, practicing a discipline that saved countless lives while maintaining pressure on the enemy. As the war neared its conclusion, the Thunderbolts' reputation had spread like wildfire. German troops feared them as if they were an unstoppable force of nature. Officers recounted the terror, speaking quietly of the sky raptors that tore supply lines apart, rendered artillery useless, and shattered morale with every sortie. Their presence symbolized the combination of industrial might, tactical innovation, and relentless courage that defined the Allied approach in the European theater. But beyond the destruction and fear, there was also a lesson in resilience and cooperation. Engineers, mechanics, drivers, and pilots all worked in synchrony, ensuring that each plane remained operational, each convoy delivered, and each mission executed with precision. The success of the Thunderbolts was not merely the triumph of the airmen, but the culmination of countless hours of dedication from every soldier and civilian supporting the effort. On May 8, 1945, as Germany surrendered, the skies finally fell silent over Europe. Thunderbolts returned to base, their engines cooling, crews weary but triumphant. They had helped shape history, not just through their firepower, but through their unwavering commitment to duty, precision, and protecting lives where possible. Veterans often recall that moment with mixed emotions: relief, pride, sorrow for those lost, and, above all, a quiet recognition of how the combined effort of men, machines, and logistics had brought down a regime that relied on fear, deception, and brutality. The Thunderbolts had not just ruled the skies, they had changed the course of the war. Post-war, many pilots returned home as heroes, but they carried the memories of destruction and camaraderie alike. The Red Ball Express drivers, mechanics, and ground crew returned to civilian life, their work often unsung, yet essential to the Allied victory. The lessons learned, the importance of coordination, logistics, and precision, would influence military operations for decades to come. And now, as we reflect on their story, it becomes clear the Thunderbolts' greatest victory wasn't merely in the destruction they wrought, but in the lives they protected, the morale they boosted, and the legacy they left behind. If you've enjoyed this story, remember that history comes alive through the stories of those who lived it. Click subscribe, share this video, and give a like if the valor of the Thunderbolts and the courage of every person supporting them moved you. Every click helps preserve these tales for future generations, ensuring that the sacrifices, triumphs, and lessons of World War II are never forgotten. Remember, the skies were ruled by more than steel and fire. They were ruled by the spirit, determination, and courage of those who dared to soar above the storm.